Good afternoon, and welcome to the Yale Center for British Arts program, Art and Context. I'm Linda Friedlander, Head of Education. Today's speaker is Jemma Field, Associate Director of Research at the Center. This talk will discuss the material realities and symbolic significance of elite female dress in the Elizabethan period through an examination of some of the Center's earliest portraits. Approaching the dressed body as a meaningful tool of communication, Jemma explores how clothing and jewelry signaled categories of identity, such as political allegiance, financial power, and social status. Attention is also given to the relative cost of raw materials in the period, the complex process of getting dressed, and even the sensory elements that were carefully considered in every outfit. Please note that this program will be recorded. Your camera and sound are muted and will remain so throughout the program. We will be using the Q&A feature on your navigation bar to gather your questions, and we'll attempt to answer as many as we can at the end of the program. But please feel free to submit questions at any time. If you need closed captioning, a live transcript is available by clicking on the icon on your toolbar. Yale University acknowledges that the indigenous people and nations, including Mohegan Mashantucket Pequot, Western Pequot, Sagittauck, Gold Hill Paugussett, Niantic, and the Quinnipiac and other Algonquin-speaking people, have stewarded through generations the lands and waterways of what is now the state of Kentucky. We honor and respect these people and nations in this land. Jemma?
Thank you, Linda. And thank you everyone for joining me today, taking time out of your day. I can't see any of you, but I know you're all there. So today I'm going to focus on some of the earliest portraits in the collection of the Yale Centre for British Art. I'm specifically discussing 6 portraits of elite women that were completed during the reign of Queen Elizabeth, who ruled England from 1558 until 1603. My main aim is to better understand these portraits sartorially. What garments were these women wearing? What materials and techniques are evident in these paintings? How much would these items have cost? And what does the dressed body tell us about the social standing, wealth, and personal virtues of these women? And what were the realities of getting dressed in this period? In unpicking the clothes and jewels that these women chose to be portrayed wearing, this talk will uncover something of the way in which these women would have moved, sounded, and smelled, and it will chart the changing fashions of the period. I will support this reading by some extant examples, but very few garments survive from this period, mainly because the exceptionally high cost of raw materials meant that clothes were refashioned, reused, and repurposed until they literally wore away. So to begin, I'll introduce you to 3 of the earliest portraits in the Centre's collection. The daughter of Henry Fitzalan, 19th Earl of Arundel, and his first wife, Lady Catherine Grey, Mary Fitzalan, who you see here, was part of the hereditary elite and born into significant wealth. She was an heiress to her father's earldom, and in 1555 she made an advantageous marriage to Thomas Howard, Duke of Norfolk. He was the only duke in England at the time, and he was second cousin to Queen Elizabeth I. There is a slight conundrum here as the portrait is dated 1565, but the Duchess wears the fashionable attire of the preceding decade, with large sleeves turned back to show the rich woven fabric of the lining, which is cloth of gold, you see that here, and to expose the costly, highly decorative foresleeves, which is this bit here, and I'll return to these. By comparison, this portrait of Queen Elizabeth from the early 1560s shows the fashion expected of that time, with fitted arms, broad shoulders, and wearing a cap rather than the French hood. The neckline is still square, but it is now slightly arched and filled in with an open partlet. Our third portrait from a couple of years later is of a woman whose identity remains unknown. She must have been of a high status and/or in high royal favour, for her clothes are of a similar fashion and calibre to those worn by the Queen that we saw in the previous image. In addition, her central jewel, which is, there's a detail from just here, depicts St. George and the Dragon, who's the patron saint of England, framed by a lion and a dragon, which were the heraldic royal supporters chosen by Queen Elizabeth to signify her position as Queen of England and Wales. The iconography thus links the jewel to the chivalric order of the Garter and would only have been appropriate for a woman who was closely linked to the Queen. Looking at these three women collectively, there are some marked similarities in their wardrobes. In the first instance, we can see that all three women are wearing a chemise, which in the period was typically called a smock or a shift. This was a ubiquitous garment for men and women of all social classes, and it was the first layer that was worn next to the skin. While technically an undergarment, certain styles of dress were cut to reveal the smock worn beneath. Elite smocks were generally made from linen, sometimes also from silk, and they could be plain or have areas that were richly decorated with lace insertions or embroidery. The cut of the neckline and the style of the cuffs also varied greatly between smocks. The great ruffs that we typically associate with the Elizabethan period have their origins in the ruffled collar of the smock, which you see here. Mary is actually wearing a very similar smock to that we just saw in the V&A. It is likewise decorated with monochrome embroidery in a stylized foliate design, and we can see it being pulled through the sleeves here. So there's a detail of it there, and you can see part of it there as well. The smock also extends above the low neckline of her gown. This is the gown, the red velvet you see here, and covers her chest. She wears a jeweled collar over the neckband that attaches to the ruff, and you can see the ruff opening just under her chin. Mary's ruff and matching cuffs are more decorative than the smock from the Victoria and Albert Museum, and they're edged with costly gold braid. In this portrait, by comparison, the smock is plain white. It is just visible here above the neckline of the gown, between the openings of the partlet, which is this jeweled piece of fabric that you see here. The sleeves have been slashed, and the smock is pulled through in puffs. You can see those little white bits there. A style that is similarly seen in the portrait of Queen Elizabeth. All three women also share a distinctive silhouette, which was achieved by structural undergarments worn over the smock and under the top gown. The firm, flat torso is the result of the supporting garment called bodies in the period. As undergarments, they are rarely seen in portraits, and very few of them survive. This portrait is unusual for showing the Countess of Southampton in a state of undress. Her waistcoat is open to reveal a pair of bodies made from carnation silk. You can clearly see that these portraits were stiffened with either bents, which was a type of dried grass stem, or with whalebone, as the rows of stitching are visible. This image is later than the three portraits I am discussing, and whalebone only became common towards the end of the 16th century. It is also clear that the Countess's bodies are a separate garment. But in the 1560s, when the three portraits that I'm currently discussing were painted, the torso was often shaped and supported by stiffening the bodice of an undergown with starched buckram. The bell-shaped bottom half of the female body was the result of the Spanish farthingale or berdigado, which was an underskirt bearing a series of hoops that increased in circumference from the waist to the ground. In this painting here, we see women wearing hoops of cane covered with fabric and sewn directly onto the outer skirts. The farthingale gained popularity in Spain as early as the 1470s, and Catherine of Aragon and her waiting women arrived in England wearing them in 1501 for Catherine's marriage to Prince Arthur. However, they subsequently adopted local fashion, and the Spanish farthingale didn't actually become popular in England until the 1540s. The hoops could be made from a variety of materials, and in England they were likely made from bents or twists of fabric. Whalebone became the later preferred choice and was first used for Queen Elizabeth's farthingales in 1580. Throughout the 1570s and the 1580s, women increasingly wore padded hip rolls over their farthingales to increase the volume at the waist. And you can see that here as the skirts sort of billow out. And this is a point that I will return to. The privileged position of these three women is thus signalled by the fashionable type and cut of their clothing, but it is also signalled by the colour and fabric. All three are wearing red velvet. Red cloth in this period was dyed using four main dye stuffs: madder, kermes, cochineal, or lichen, and these could be used individually or in combination. These products yield a vast array of shades that were evocatively named. Examples include crimson, scarlet, stamel, murrey, carnation, and maiden's blush. And it's difficult to determine exactly what shade these women would have been wearing, but it's likely that they are crimson. The specific shade mattered as it represented the dye stuff that had been used, and these products varied greatly in price and were restricted to certain social classes by law. As a result, contemporaries were well versed at determining and assessing the different shades of people's clothes. Sumptuary legislation remained in effect throughout the entire 16th century. These laws specified the type, amount, and colour of fabrics that could be worn by each level of society, as well as the trimmings and accessories that could accompany them. In theory, then, an outfit embodied the wearer's rank and broadcast their wealth. Crimson velvet, for example, was only allowed to be worn by women who were the rank of a baroness or above, or who were married to a knight of the garter or a privy councillor. And this is a pair of mittens that survives to this day, being made out of crimson velvet. There were always exceptions to these rules, however, particularly for women who served in the Queen's household. And while many scholars have questioned the efficacy of sumptuary legislation, its continued existence throughout the Tudor period underscores the high cost of clothes, as well as the belief that clothing could signal categories of identity. The ability of clothes to assert the financial power and social rank of the wearer translated into portraits, with artists often paying close attention to different textiles and textures, construction methods, and types of decoration. Portraits are, of course, heavily mediated, but read in conjunction with archival sources and extant objects, they tell us much about the historical body. For example, while a static two-dimensional object, this portrait nonetheless points us to the smellscape of the Tudor court. The beads that this woman wears are openwork or filigree. I'm talking about these beads here, and would have been filled with pomander, a mixture of aromatic substances such as clove, cinnamon, damask rose, ambergris, musk, or civet that were dissolved over heat along with various types of gum resin and then moulded into balls. This surviving pomander bead demonstrates how the perfume could be refreshed by opening the jewel and replacing the scented paste. Earrings, necklaces, bracelets, buttons, and girdles were fashioned to hold scented products. Holly Duggan has done much to map the cultural, material, and metaphorical world of smell in early modern England and its complicated relationship to medicine, luxury, divinity, and empire. For my purposes today, however, it is important just to recognise that scents were a marker of morality and status, and that clothes, accessories, and jewellery were common repositories for aromatic products. Garments and linens were perfumed by being stored with sweet bags. These were cloth bags filled with heady animal products of ambergris, musk, or civet, or with more floral and herbal scents such as rosemary, jasmine, lavender, or rose. The size of one's wardrobe, as well as the size of one's wallet, naturally dictated the number of bags that were needed. Looking on a royal scale, Queen Elizabeth's wardrobe brought as many as 60 sweet bags in a year. These were diverse in material and decoration. In 1571, they included silk bags lined with leather and trimmed with gold, as well as bags that were made from just plain fustian. As well as being stored with aromatics, garments were individually perfumed before wear by being dusted with powdered musk, civet, ambergris, or rose. Other wardrobe items were fashioned from perfumed materials such as ambergris scented leather. All three portraits that I'm discussing show the sitter holding a pair of gloves that include a leather component, and you see details of the three images here. This reflects the ubiquity of leather gloves in this period and points to the fashion for having them scented. This was most often achieved with ambergris, which in its waxy, greasy form was literally smeared onto the leather. Queen Elizabeth's favour for scented gloves did much to increase their general popularity, and they were often given to her as gifts. In 1576, for example, the Earl of Oxford, Edward de Vere, chose to give the Queen a pair of perfumed gloves that he had bought in Italy. By 1580, the term Oxford gloves denoted gloves made from perfumed leather. 15 pairs of Oxford gloves are listed in this 1582 inventory of a London haberdasher's shop and were valued at 2 shillings and 4p a pair. This was quite expensive. It's hard to give a sense of cost, but this was about the same as 13 chickens. It is also instructive to note that this haberdasher stocked gloves that cost as little as 5p a pair, or about 6 times cheaper than a perfumed option. We also know that Lady Anne Clifford regularly bought kidskin gloves that cost 10p a pair, or she bought dogskin gloves that cost just a little bit more at 1 shilling. On the other hand, though, ornate pairs where the gauntlets were richly embroidered with precious metals and pearls could be staggeringly expensive. For her wedding in 1608, for example, Lady Frances Cavendish spent £60 on a pair of custom-made gloves. Again, it's hard to grasp the extraordinary cost of these items, but this is a time when a knight had an annual income of around £400. So £60 for one pair of gloves is not insignificant. As with all garments and accessories, the cost of gloves varied widely and was determined by the raw materials and the type and amount of decoration. This inventory reflects the widespread fashion for gloves, which were worn by both men and women and across a wide range of social classes. As my colleague Edward Town has determined, this haberdasher stocked 17 different types of ready-made gloves, which made a combined total of 185 pairs. These were made from a variety of animals, including sheep, lamb, and goat. As well as providing a gateway to the smellscape of the dress body, portraits also contain evidence of the ways in which garments sounded and interacted with environmental factors. The use of gold and silver in textiles has a long history, whether this was woven into the fabric or embroidered onto the fabric. And here you see examples of both types. Mary's sleeves are made from cloth of gold, like I mentioned earlier. You see them here. While the second portrait shows Frances Lady Chandos, another high-ranking woman. She wears a bodice and skirt where the front closures are edged with guards richly embroidered in silver thread. And these are the guards down the front that you see with the silver embroidery. And a matching design is also visible on her hanging sleeves. And you can see a part of that hanging sleeve there, which extends down behind her arm. Both Mary's cloth of gold sleeves and Frances's embroidered passages would have glistened and sparkled in the sunlight. They also would have glistened and sparkled in the candlelight that illuminated court entertainment, such as banquets, masques, and dances. These visual qualities were also observed of spangles, or O's, that became increasingly common around the turn of the century. These are the little gold discs that you see all over her sleeves and also on her partlet up here. These are essentially the forerunner of our modern day sequin and were made from copper, silver, or silver gilt. They were hung liberally on garments and accessories where they tinkled and shone. And moving to this portrait, we've now moved to the French farthingale, which may seem way more dramatic than the introduction of the new fashion for spangles. However, this style of farthingale developed gradually over a period of about a decade. Throughout the 1580s, the waist circumference of the Spanish farthingale kept widening as elite women wore increasing amounts of padding around the hips. By 1590, this had become too cumbersome and gave way to the French farthingale, which is also known as the drum or the round farthingale. The drum farthingale was a frame made from whalebone and/or bents that projected straight out from the hips, from which the skirts then fell vertically to the ground. Again, as an undergarment, they are rarely seen in portraits. This satirical drawing shows male dancers with their crimson skirts pulled up to reveal the farthingale underneath, which is likely made from black taffeta. The drum farthingale structure had a significant impact on women's gowns and petticoats, as they demanded a large quantity of covering fabric. While a gown in the 1550s normally required between 7 and 10 yards of fabric, or about 21 to 30 feet, by the end of the century, this amount had almost doubled. The full skirted garments worn over the drum farthingale routinely required between 14 and 16 yards of fabric, or roughly 42 to 48 feet. A large part of this expanse was taken up by pinning the skirts into a flounce, which covered the hard edge of the farthingale. And you see Mary Clopton's flounce here, which is how the fabric is sort of undulating around in a circle. Flounces took a variety of shapes, and they could take up to an hour to pin onto the wearer. This leads me to a very small and very practical item of the Tudor wardrobe, the pin. A woman could easily use several dozen pins in getting dressed. They not only were used to construct the flounce, but they also secured other garments, including ruffs, foreparts, partlets, sleeves, cuffs, and even jewels. The vast number that were used on women's clothing is reflected in the accounts of the period. In the first 6 months of 1602, for example, Lady Anne Clifford bought 4,500 pins. The high demand for pins meant that haberdashers stocked significant amounts. Returning to this 1582 inventory, Edward Town has determined that William Ginn was holding some 50,000 pins at the time that his stock was recorded. Like the gloves I mentioned earlier, this inventory also clearly demonstrates the varying grades of pins that were available. Like clothing, the cost of a pin was dependent on the type and amount of material used and whether it was made in England or was imported. Thus, one could buy 1,000 pins for 6p or 200 pins for 2 shillings from this haberdasher. Moving from the practical to the iconographical, Mary's ample petticoat is woven with a large-scale botanical design comprised of flowers, vegetables, and fruits. This points to a growing trend to include figurative elements in clothes and jewellery, which is reflected in portraits. For women, these figurative elements most commonly attest to family lineage or to personal virtues such as wisdom, fertility, or piety. This portrait of Mary was painted in conjunction with her marriage to Thomas Clopton of Kentwell Hall in around 1590. The botanical design makes a general reference to springtime and fecundity, which was apposite for a young woman, many of whom hoped to continue the marital line. More precise meanings are inscribed by individual horticultural specimens, which a contemporary viewer would have easily understood. For example, Mary's ability to bear children is affirmed by the pomegranates and peascods that split open to reveal seeds and peas. Other flowers, including carnations, bluebells, and thistles, safely locate Mary's fertility within the bounds of marriage and affirm her female virtue, for these were widely recognised as tokens of love, betrothal, and constancy. In addition, a fresh marigold, symbolic of fidelity, is pinned to Mary's left sleeve, and a rose and a sprig of honeysuckle, referring to love and devotion, are attached to her neckline. I hope you can see my little arrow pointing those 3 flowers out there. This portrait is roughly contemporaneous with that of Mary Clopton and depicts Elizabeth Knightley, the daughter of Edward Seymour, Duke of Somerset, who in around 1577 married the staunch Puritan Sir Richard Knightley. Like Mary Clopton before her, Elizabeth Knightley's bodily display contains personalised references. But rather than her clothing, these references are carried through her jewellery. Knightley wears a heavy gold chain of enamel work, table-cut diamonds and pearls, which has a large figurative pendant right at the centre. Pinned to her right sleeve is a closed locket, which likely is a watch. On each wrist, she wears a bracelet of gold set with diamonds. Like Clopton, items of the natural world are incorporated, with the carnation pinned to her left sleeve as a sign of devotion, and in her left hand she holds the tail of a small snake, which was a common symbol of wisdom. The jewelled pieces seen in this portrait were of high personal significance to Knightley, but she chose to wear them in at least 2 other portraits, although they are seen in different configurations. I'm indebted to my colleagues Edward Town and Jessica David, who made the connection between the portraits and provided me with photos of the version at Longford Castle that you see here. In this version, the pendant that was at the centre of the chest in the YCBA portrait now appears on her right sleeve, and the watch is now open, lying by her left hand. She again wears the bracelet, and I apologise that they're hard to see, but in the real version, you can see them very clearly. In real life, you can see them very clearly. They're just here. The volume of jewellery obviously testifies to Knightley's wealth, but it is also richly symbolic. In the first instance, the jewelled bracelets visually attest to Knightley's pious virtue, for they include the Epistle of Paul to the Philippians, chapter 1, verse 21, which translates to, "For me to live is Christ, and to die is gain." Or, in other words, life on earth was living for Christ, but death was a joy, for it meant being in his presence. The pendant that is shown in both portraits is a phoenix rising out of the fire, which holds both personal and political relevance. The phoenix was a mythical bird that could infinitely regenerate, and was thus used in the period as a symbol of chastity and rebirth. In the 1570s, the phoenix became associated with Queen Elizabeth as an emblem of her virginity and her ability to nevertheless regenerate the Tudor dynasty. The Queen owned and wore pieces of jewellery featuring the immortal bird, and she was painted by Nicholas Hilliard wearing such jewel in around 1575, which you see here. Phoenix jewels were accordingly worn at court as a sign of monarchical allegiance, or they were commissioned as gifts for the Queen and given to her as a mark of flattery. For Knightley then, the Phoenix jewel evidences her belonging to the elite world of court culture, as well as her loyalty to the Queen. More personally, the mythical creature testifies to Knightley's elite pedigree. Through her father, Edward Seymour, Knightley was the niece of Jane Seymour, the third wife of King Henry VIII. The phoenix had featured in Jane Seymour's identifying emblem. By including such figurative pieces in her portraits, Knightley preserved evidence of her natal lineage, piety, and wisdom for posterity. I want to conclude today's talk by returning to the object of the portrait. Naturally, portraits are mediated, and sitting for a portrait was an intentional and political act that allowed the sitter to make choices about how they would be seen. People sat for portraits in their best finery, and the painted image rarely captures any hint of sartorial imperfection, such as stains, evidence of mending, or wrinkles. And while elements could be completely removed, they could, of course, also be made up. Yet when used in conjunction with other sources, portraits help us to build a more comprehensive and accessible understanding of historical appearances and to capture something of the people who appear in them. They can tell us a lot about how an outfit was put together, what colour combinations were favoured, what types of decoration and accessories were considered appropriate, and how the silhouette changed over time. Portraits also help us to trace connections between people and to examine individual and collective identities that were visualised through bodily display long after the original garment, jewel, or accessory has vanished. Thank you.
Thank you, Jemma. That was really fascinating, and we have lots of questions coming in. If anyone is holding on to a question and wants to put it through the Q&A option, please do so now. There's some more coming through here. Yes, there will be a recording available. There's just a quick note, someone saying that this was an extraordinary talk and that they hope there is a recording that will be available on our website in the future. A question about the sleeves that you were talking about in the beginning. The question is, what prompted the fashion of the undergarment showing through those slits? Is it a myth that it is based on battlefield sites, undergarments showing through after soldiers were run through with swords?
Ooh, I've actually never come across that. My understanding is, and it might be helpful if I go back to show what I'm talking about, although they're right at the beginning. How do I do that quickly? I'll just skip back. Okay, so the fashion for this, so my understanding is that this enabled people to obviously show more of what they were wearing underneath. So I hope you got a sense that outfits in this period were heavily layered. People are wearing sort of 4 or 5 garments, one on top of the other. And although you only see, one garment, by slashing these, you could pull through another and evidence even more of this, costly fabric that you were wearing. Mm-hmm. On the other hand, when it's white like this is really clearly tied to notions of morality and hygiene, as well as wealth. To be able to wear white clothing required a lot of clean white clothing, required a lot of money and labor in order to keep it like that. So we have special women who specialized in laundering these garments and keeping them clean and crisp. So elites would have, owned dozens of these items, and being able to showcase that you had the financial ability to not only buy but maintain these garments was a mark of social standing. So my sense really is that it was just a way of being able to show even more of your wardrobe than would otherwise be enabled.
Okay. On the note of status, 2 questions. I'm going to pair them together. Was it preferable to have imported or local cloth? Did one indicate a higher status or the other?
Yep.
And the second part is, how do they clean these garments that took so much effort to do?
Yes, great questions. Now, there were different sites of production at this time. So when we're talking about velvet, these were typically imported from the Italian city-states. And there was definitely a sense that where the cloth came from was better or worse, as it were. So if you're going to be wearing, and there is a sense that people could tell by looking at garments where that cloth originated. Now, in this period, England is not a place that produces velvets of this quality. So these are all going to be imported. Then you find them that they'll be in the so-called Book of Rates, which was essentially taxes on products coming in. That's true also of the dye stuffs. So cochineal and kermes is being imported as well. So in the Book of Rates, you will see at what level these items are basically like import duties, which reflected then the cost of this fabric in the period. Now, tied actually to the idea of the smock, so that garment that was worn sort of next to the skin was really designed, being of linen, to absorb bodily odors, sweat, etc. And that was the item that was regularly laundered. The overgarments that you see here were not regularly washed. They were what was called dry brushed, and there were people in the royal wardrobe who were brushers. So these people essentially knew how to brush a garment very well to get rid of dirt, staining, keep it clean. But there are also people who specialized in the removal of stains. So it's not that people were impeccable and these garments never got stained and therefore never got washed. They absolutely did. And there are actually really fascinating accounts in the household books of Bess of Hardwick, where the professionals have been unable to get stains out of her garments. And so she has literally unpicked and taken out the area that is now permanently soiled and then put back in a different type of fabric to that area. The other option was, of course, to then the garment was no longer wearable, but the fabric could be used for, say, a piece of soft furnishing, like a cushion cover. That's very common as well.
Okay, there's actually more questions coming in than I can possibly answer, that you could possibly answer in our time, but I'm going to try to get through these. There's a question about the snake in one of the last portraits that we saw. Is it a real snake or a fabric snake? What was the association for that again?
Commonly wisdom. So there's actually a portrait that survives of Queen Elizabeth also with a snake. There's a weird, that's an instance where obviously Elizabeth Knightley is not sitting for a portrait holding a snake, but it is intended to be read as a real snake. It's not made of fabric. And again, it's just there in order to make a symbolic reference to her personal or interior virtues. And I guess it's a good example of using portraits as a way to express something that is completely intangible by looking at someone. It's a focus on the idea of trying to bring something of the interior to the exterior and then preserve that. So even though Elizabeth Knightley is now dead, long dead, hundreds of years, we still can read into that. And oftentimes we've lost the association of what the original meaning was. But sometimes, as in the case with the snake, we have written references to it and other pictorial means that reinforce it, that lends, sort of gives us the ability to be able to read this. And actually a good example here is right in front of me with this passage of real fruits and flowers in the back of the portrait of Queen Elizabeth. And that's abutted right next to the cloth of state and a throne chair. It's not that that's actually how that would have looked in real life, but the passage of the fruit and the flowers really, this is painted around the time of the succession crisis. And the point is to try and refer to Elizabeth's, at this time, fertile promise. She was the most marriageable hand in all of Europe. And so what we find here is references to that through flower and fruit symbolism. So again, we get the pomegranates, we get fig leaves, we get honeysuckle and roses and carnations, all of which held specific meanings, but also unite to give an overall sense of sort of abundance, fertility, I should say fertile promise, really, in relation to the sitter.
This question came in a few times, so I'm going to make sure to ask it. How much, or do we have an estimate of how much these garments weighed? Like, were they very heavy to wear? Were there other types of supports? You mentioned the bodice and all that kind of thing.
Yes, that's a really good question. And yes, very heavy. We have some really interesting references, actually. So one of which is from Anna of Denmark, who was the wife of King James VI of Scotland, first of England, who was Queen Elizabeth's successor. They arrive in England in 1603. But while she is in Scotland, well, before that period, she actually sends a gown back. And in the account book of her tailors, it says the words, because it was over heavy. So essentially she is rejecting this gown because it's impossible to wear because it just weighs her down so much. And that's generally related to not only the yardage, but the amount of precious metal that was attached to these. We also have references, if we look to the continent in Italy, of women also, people exclaiming over the weight of the gowns that women wore on special occasions and how they sort of not had to practice to wear them, but that it was really quite a burden. Now, the structural undergarments that I've referenced, the pair of bodies and the farthing Gale, part of wearing those is so the weight of the garments rests on your shoulders rather than, say, your hips and gives you, problems with your back. So the bodies had eyelet holes. Actually, I could go to that image of the Countess of Southampton. I'm going the wrong way, where you can actually see, because she's wearing a very sheer. Okay, so see underneath here, they look like little bows with silver extensions. These are points. And essentially what they've done is they've laced her underskirts to the bodies. Now the bodies then have the shoulders and are fully supported. So they are actually taking the weight of her garments. These are the tabs of the bodies, and underneath everything is tied to it. Mm-hmm. Off the top of my head, though, I can't think of what the weights actually were, but we do have references to it being significant.
A few questions coming in about pronounce this correctly, the pomander beads, those scented beads that they were wearing. I'll combine these two questions. Were the scents that were worn or carried based on personal preference, or did they carry other attributes and meanings? Did they have different scents that were worn seasonally? And then the other question is, were these at all used to protect the wearer from disease such as the plague? Absolutely. And I mentioned Holly Duggan's name in the talk, and I do, if anyone's interested in reading up on smell in this period in England, I do really recommend her book, and she also has an article as well, because it's a very complicated topic. But sorry, what is the title of the book? Because some people are asking for it. Or the name of the author again?
Holly Duggan, Duggan. I can't think of the title off the top of my head. But you should be able to find it easily. And if you can't, I'll do it here on the side.
They can email education and we'll find it for you.
Okay. So, the question. Yes, about the plague. I'll start with that. Well, actually, they're sort of connected questions. So there is a sense that it's very hard to know about personal preference. There is definitely the sense that some were fashionable. For example, a lot of these products were imported. Again, this is similar to the fabrics and the dye stuffs. Items that were imported still had a sense of elevated top quality. So in royal accounts, we often find that musk, civet, balsam is being imported from the Mediterranean. Then, cinnamon, cloves, these are all imports outside. These are not grown locally, these are all imported. So there is a sense that these can be tied to obviously the exotic. These are foreign, expensive goods that are being used. So in one sense, they're a real mark of status, access to products. the networks that one is associating in. There are definitely, in this time period, smell was considered absolutely tied to health and well-being. One can think of, those, I find them very creepy. You can see them sometimes of doctors wearing masks with very long noses during plague. And that's because those noses were stuffed with smelling good. So whether it was rosemary was supposed to be particularly good to ward off plague, because it was thought that you could catch disease by breathing it in. Air was really considered to be dangerous, but also to be healthy, depending what kind of air it was. And smell was definitely associated within that rubric.
Interesting and timely. A question coming in about choice. To what degree did these women have a choice to what they wore? Were the dresses selected for them? And would women in Elizabeth's household have had their clothing provided, or would they be able to pick from a selection?
Okay, so in any big household, obviously including the royal household, servants were typically provided with livery on top of their wages. And so that was either an allowance specifically for their clothing, or it was actual clothing. Queen Elizabeth is quite famous, as are many early modern women, to be fair, of gifting clothes to her waiting women. And again, this is a mark of personal favour, which was really was able to operate as such because of the high cost of these garments. So women would share clothes either when they had been worn, which was not considered to be bad. It was actually considered to be quite favourable to have a garment that had previously been worn, especially by the Queen, or they could be ready-made and gifted on. There is definitely a sense that women had a choice over the garments that they wore. And again, this is difficult because of things like status. Obviously, the lower down you go, the less choice you're going to have, literally because the less amount of clothing you have. Queen Elizabeth had around 1,600 garments at her death that were inventoried. We have accounts either in Spain too, where the queens would give preference for the item that they wanted to wear at a particular time. Within that, there were obviously things that were considered appropriate and not appropriate depending on the situation. So, I mean, this is a good example. Elizabeth Vernon, as a countess, no woman would ever have gone out looking like this. It's just not considered appropriate. She is absolutely in a state of undress. So there are a sense of women, and if you're going to be at court, for example, Elizabeth is going to wear a different outfit to that which she is going to wear, say, in her own home when she is either by herself or if she's entertaining guests. So there's, the social, like we do today, it might be, for me, I would be absolutely comfortable in my own home in my pajamas, but I'm definitely not going out to work in my pajamas. That's that kind of thing.
Okay. Let's see, one or two more. There was a question about collars. Can you speak a little bit to the elaborate collars, the different folding? Was there significant to how they were built?
Sure. Let's go to a different image. Okay, so I'm not sure if they wanted to look at these ones or the later ones where they get increasingly elaborate. So in these situations, collars are really quite amazing for being able to completely change the look of an outfit, even if the rest of it has sort of stayed quite the same. Now, in this time period that we're looking at, the 1560s, the ruffled collar is very small and worn very high up under the chin. These were generally always constructed from very fine grades of linen. Again, the type of grade of linen affected the cost, but some linen cloths that were considered appropriate for neckwear were things like Holland or cambric or lawn. These are very fine grades of linen. And we do actually have examples surviving from the period where you can see how they're almost see-through because they are so fine and so delicate. With the ruffs, essentially they're gathered, so they're really long pieces of linen that are tightly gathered into the neckband so that it ruffles. They are set by women using like a hot poker to set them. They're starched, they're laundered, they're starched, and then they're set using hot irons. These, they come in all different lengths and configurations. Sometimes you find these ones are set in figure of eights, but sometimes you find double ruffs where there is 2 layers of them, or they increase in width and size. So essentially, as the period progresses, sorry, this isn't a very good way of figuring out where the next slide is to show you. Oh, here we go. As time moves on, they get larger and larger. Now, when I maybe you remember me saying that what Mary Fitzgerald is actually wearing is a smock, and her collar is actually part of that item. Now, by the time we get to someone like Frances Bridges here, hers is not. This is a completely separate item that was washed, laundered, starched, set, completely independent of anything else. Mm-hmm. And that's really because by this point, the elaborate nature of these items meant that they needed, special attention, and it would have been much easier to have them by themselves than attached to an entire garment or gown, as essentially the smock was.
Okay, I think we have time, if you're up for it, for one or two more. There's a question about the jewels that they're wearing. Are all of them real? Would some of them have been possibly glass or something like that for the sake of the portrait, or was all of this, full tilt gems, rubies?
Again, difficult question. We do know that obviously they're called paste gems when they're not quite real and they're made out of, glass or some other material, do absolutely survive from the period, and that people did wear them. They also wore, carnelian, there's stones, agate, jet. I mean, these are stones that were worn by the wealthy as well as slightly lower down the social scale. So it's not all about rubies, pearls, emeralds, diamonds, but the most common ones that you do see over and over again for women, although this is not a good example to be showing that, is pearls and diamonds. Those are the pearls, particularly for women, they become increasingly common, and you generally see those a lot. But the surviving actual jewels from the period do show that when you see things, like this example, and sorry, I haven't got a detail right now, but there's little figures here which are in white enamel and they're pointing and holding this diamond here. But we know from examples that literally would have looked like that. There's a very intricate figurative jewels made by extremely talented goldsmiths that were absolutely configured into shapes like this, as well as we have surviving books of designs as well, some even by Hans Holbein, for example.
Excellent. And we have a lot of wonderful theories coming out. Someone notes, and they make the point to say they're not sure if this is true, but the scented beads that were woven into the fabrics, is it true that they could also contain poisons, and that there was an attempt on the Queen's life where this was sewn into the garment?
Yeah, that is quite, I actually don't know whether that's true or not. I've never looked at it, but I do know that it's a common, I think they tried to poison Queen Elizabeth with a pair of gloves, even. Mm-hmm. Knowing her penchant for perfumed gloves, they gave her a pair that were poisoned. It didn't work, but I do think it's quite possible. I mean, people were quite ingenious with poisons at this time period, and it is absolutely true that seams of garments were made to be hollow and filled with, like musk or civet or ambergris or whatever, so that the actual garment that you're wearing, it's a bit later than these portraits here, the archival references I'm thinking of. But so the actual, the dress that you wore would have smelt that way. And I feel, and I shouldn't just hypothesize on the spot, but I feel like it's totally plausible that one could also put in something dodgy in there.
And our wonderful audience has sleuthed out the title of the book, Holly Duggan, The Ephemeral History of Perfume, Scent, and Scents in Early Modern England, from 2011. I'm going to leave it at that. Thank you, Jemma, for this extraordinary talk. My apologies to everyone. Really, over 40 or more questions were coming in as we were going. So you might have to do a part 2 for this. Please join us again on Thursday for our digital docent tour. Margaret Mann is presenting the Horse Lover's Guide to the YCBA collection. It's going to be a lot of fun. Thank you all for joining, and take care.
Thank you.